Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which is being run by the Campaign for Social Science as part of their Election 24 series. The campaign aims to demonstrate how social science improves public policy, society, and all of our lives. And it highlights the value of applied social science and advocates for its greater use in decision-making and in government. So a lot of the purpose of this webinar series is not just for you here today, but for the incoming government to appraise the social science perspective on hot button policy issues. The campaign promotes the benefits of investing in social science to deliver evidence-based solutions to the significant challenges and opportunities that face us, and who could argue with that? So today's event is part of that series, and you can see the rest of the series and all the forthcoming events on the online hub, which is linked to in the chat. We're going right back to September last year. And all of those seminars, all of those webinars are seeking to foreground social science research and help the next government to benefit from the insights that they bring to some of the challenges they'll be facing. So as Director of Sense About Science, I am delighted about two things today. The first, that social science briefings will be winging their way to the next government. I think pathways to policy is a key challenge for the social sciences, and it's brought together some fantastic people in the webinars past and indeed in our session today, and I'll be introducing them to you very soon. I'm also delighted that I've been asked to chair this particular webinar on AI and society. It's a great frustration to me as the Director of Sense About Science that we've spent around 10 years, maybe not longer now, talking about everything dialogue, engagement, public outreach, and yet find ourselves on a subject so utterly profound in its ability to reorganize our society, with a really big divide between the haves and the have-nots as part of that discussion. There are politicians even announcing multi-million-dollar data strategies without really understanding what big data is. And there's a real danger, I think, we face, that we're missing the moment when it's okay to ask, what is this and what does it mean? And as some people gallop off into really quite technical and difficult discussions, or quite deep and thoughtful reflections on the world we want to live in, a lot of people are not yet taking part in those discussions, including our decision makers, the journalists who should be scrutinizing, and many others, and us as a voting public too. So I think it's utterly of the moment that we should have this discussion. I'm delighted with the people we have to kick us off in it, because they are really well versed in thinking about these issues very much in the round and in an applied sense. We have Professor Kaska Porayska-Pomsta, who is Professor of Artificial Intelligence at University College London. Kaska has said in her previous discussions about this subject that AI should be fascinating but not frightening. And I think also a comment of yours, Kaska, that I picked up that's incredibly important, I think, is that we shouldn't be dwelling overly on the tech or on society, but looking at them in the round to understand how to move forward in a way that people are happy with. So I'm very much looking forward to your comments. And we're also joined by Professor Fraser Sampson, who is the Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometric Material at, I'm going to go for the whole thing here, CENTRIC. It's the Centre of Excellence in Terrorism, Resilience, Intelligence and Organised Crime Research at Sheffield Hallam University. Very experienced indeed, and some of you may have seen Fraser's comments about the fact that the law is not keeping up with AI and the surveillance society, and issuing government warnings about the need to take action in this space. So I'm delighted that we have both of them to kick us off with a brief 10-minute introduction, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions and debate. Please notice the Q&A session. It's not a chat function, it's a Q&A session section at the bottom of your screens is where you can start posting questions, and please do bring them in as soon as people start talking. You're welcome to post them straight away, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can throughout the discussion. But first, to kick us off, Kaska.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I am really delighted to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this webinar. My contribution will focus on AI in education as a specialist area of AI design and application, and also as an area which so far has received very little systematic attention in the wider developments and discourse, and indeed in policy concerning AI. It's also a domain which provides an example, a very concrete example of high stakes domain, which also comes with evidence, quite systematic and important evidence for how we may think about the design, deployment, and use of AI in the wild, if you like. I'll start by saying, just giving a very quick definition that I use of AI. It's a special form of technology which is built purposefully to act as an autonomous agent, and one that can act in the environment in which it is deployed, that can adapt to this environment moment by moment. And it is also a technology which can learn from the environment. And there are obviously many types of AI agents that are being designed for different types of environments, and the differences can be as big as the difference between AI robots that are being sent to Mars, for example, to explore the physical landscape of a new planet, and AI agents that interact directly with the humans, with us, for example, when they act as tutors to learners of some knowledge domain. Today I want to focus on the design and application of AI in the context of education, and to use this as a prompt to highlight several things. First of all, the existence of AI in education as a field of research and application. I also want to point to evidence that this field offers for the way that we may design and deploy AI in education in valuable ways, valuable to the society, and as examples of best practices in this context. And also, I want to highlight or spotlight some potential implications that this field may bring to the equation for policy action. But before I dive into the AI in education in particular, I also wanted to make a comment about the construct or the concept of education, because we often equate it with formal school-based learning and teaching, the so-called K-12 education. But I think it's worth actually considering it in a more broad sense, in terms of lifelong learning across different contexts and ages, along with all of the social, cognitive, and affective factors that are critical to human learning and development. And indeed, this is this broad focus is the focus of the AI in education research field, which, it might come as a surprise to many, has been active for almost 50 years. So it has actually developed in tandem and in many ways together with other AI subfields. This field draws substantially from different disciplines. It is inherently an interdisciplinary field. And the fields include computer science, human-computer interaction design, as well as the learning sciences, psychological sciences, and scientific methods for evaluating human cognition and development. Over the years, AI has gone through quite an extraordinary journey of first trying to faithfully replicate human teaching and learning practices in order to scale up best educational practices to a field which has explored new approaches to supporting learning through AI, and which has led to some critical exemplars of new ways to nurture learners' autonomy, self-regulation, and self-actuation, amongst other things. In other words, the competencies which fundamentally underpin human learning and development. All along, the field has drawn from basic psychological sciences, social and the learning sciences, and more recently also from the ethics as well. What is special about this field is that it offers rigorous evidence of efficacy of many of its approaches to using AI in education. And it is important to emphasize here that this evidence largely does not as yet offer substantial evidence of effectiveness, insofar as for most part, large longitudinal trials have been out of reach for many AI ed researchers around the globe. And this is also due to the complexity of such trials at the front line of education. That's one of the reasons. And the other reason is actually that AI ed has been notoriously underfunded, a point that I will return to in my conclusions very briefly. So what this means is that a lot of evaluations are of single systems with relatively small numbers of learners in specific contexts of use. Nevertheless, the evidence that we do have available provides quite rich and informed basis for directing our policies and actions. And just to give you kind of a snapshot of the kind of evidence that we do have available, that we have generated over the years in the field, we have evidence, for example, of intelligent tutoring systems and adaptive learning environments, environments which are driven essentially by AI adaptive capabilities, that shows that these systems are at least as effective in many cases in improving learning outcomes in one-to-one tutorial settings, in particular in well-defined domains such as STEM subjects, such as maths, for example. And there are actually a number of meta-reviews and even meta-reviews which are available on the subject under the auspices of the International Society of Artificial Intelligence in Education, and in particular scientific papers which provide a whole provide evidence which is linked to the design of these systems, which can be found in the journal of the society. We also have evidence that adaptive environments which support learners by considering their motivational and emotional states are much more efficacious than those that do not. And again, the field has, the community has invested a lot of effort to understand how we can detect and interpret motivational and emotional states in order to provide appropriate scaffolds. And again, drawing in this work from substantial research in the psychological sciences and educational research. Another form of evidence comes from work which is done on help-seeking behaviors in adaptive environments, which show that systems which scaffold the way that learners seek help as part of their adaptive and pedagogical designs are extremely efficacious in supporting not only the acquisition of knowledge itself, but also of the strategies for learning. And finally, and I think most importantly, I think, because I think this actually represents the future of not only AI in education applications, but of AI more broadly, we have evidence that giving users, in this case learners, access to and manage control over their data and the interpretation of the data by AI can actually lead to the development of really fundamental skills for human learning development and socio-emotional functioning, namely self-explanation competencies and self-regulation skills, and ultimately metacognitive capacities. What is really important here for connecting between social and computational aspects of AI designs is that these different forms of evidence come with detailed examinations of the different AI features and also of the way that they are mediated through human-computer interaction that may be responsible for the effects observed, which essentially gives us clues as to how we can map between technology design and its use in educational best practices. So as a research domain, AI in education does not only serve to engineer AI products for education, but also as a research methodology for studying human learning and development. And the field offers a pretty holistic approach to how AI can be designed for human use with human benefit at its core. Unfortunately, it is also an area which is rarely drawn on as the basis for policy decisions, and it is notoriously underfunded, as I already signaled. In the mainstream of AI discussions, it is often as if the AI in education field does not exist, and many decisions related to AI in education are grounded in market and edtech industry interests. And I should say, to the exasperation not only of AI in education and educational researchers, but increasingly also of educational practitioners and learners. So in terms of actions, and speaking of the priority actions on AI, and in particular using the AI in education as an example, I would highlight the following points. It seems critical to draw on the decades of research that the field, the different research fields, in this particular case, the AI in education field affords, in order to make informed decisions about what might and might not work in the context of AI applications for human learning. We have a lot to leverage from the evidence that we have and a lot of experimentation that has been done, especially from AI in education field, which is inherently working at the frontier of human-computer interaction and human cognition.
Kaska, I'm nervous that we might miss one of your important points. So,
I will
ask you to belt through them, and we'll come back to the longer discussion of them. I will pick them up with you, but could I ask you to just to pulse through quickly? Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll speed up. I have a couple more points to make very quickly. I will signal them. Another thing that actually Tracey has already signaled in her introduction is that we really need to create and work as an ecosystem of stakeholders to make the best decisions, because at the moment certain constituents within this particular ecosystem are notoriously excluded from the proverbial table. We also need a room for managed and accountable co-creation and AI in education experimentation with frontline educational practitioners and researchers at the core. And ultimately, we need funding to support research to generate evidence, not just of individual systems, but of generalizable principles of AI human interactions, and again, in particular here in this context, AI in education, learner interactions in different contexts. All of this in service of generating critical evidence and knowledge which is needed for responsible AI that is of value to the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. And despite the fact that I was actually focused on education, you raised things which are clearly highly relevant right across the piece. Fraser, Sampson.
Tracey, thank you. Sorry, the technology told me that you'd muted me again, but I think it's now, I managed to take that off. So thank you very much for the introduction. I need to correct the record, if I may. I was, until recently, the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner, but in November, I handed back the keys to the then Home Secretary, but I carry on the work I'm doing with Centric. We've got 10 minutes to explore governance and regulation of AI in policing and security. I thought I'd start in Hollywood, given the recent industrial action there. And we've seen how our favorite actors and writers have woken up to the implications of unregulated AI. A few hours of shots of Tom Cruise and AI can now make a new film every day from here to eternity. Sorry, you can't avoid film references when you look at this stuff, but you can now drive him off cliffs, fly him into buildings, stretch him, age him, all without stunt doubles or risk of lawsuits. In fact, AI could now make every mission possible. See what I mean? But think about it. AI in that context means the producers only need to pay for one day in the studio, and they don't need the studio. As for the score and the script, well, AI can sign you up everyone from Taylor Swift to Shakespeare in Love. When it comes to film genres, law and policing, of course, feature very highly. But the reality isn't glamorous at all, as I've learned in nearly 45 years in the sector, which is the same amount of experience as the captain of Titanic, who we will come to shortly. But lawyers have already spent a lot of time anguishing over how to fit existing legal concepts around AI. Colleagues worry about whether a robot can be classed as a driver or whether a machine is capable of dishonesty. But the one research question I asked them is, well, why are we trying to answer this? It's an interesting debate to ask, can a robot act? The answer, of course, is yes, if you've seen the Terminator films. But that's very unlikely to be of much practical help in regulating AI effectively. I'm much more interested to know what is the basis for believing that our prehistoric concepts like copyright or guilt can be adapted to meet the peculiar challenges of an AI world. To take the idea of a witness, for example, AI-driven devices capture vast amounts, yottabytes, of relevant information about crimes every second. But in most Western jurisdictions, a witness must still be a human being. Why? Why can't a court receive evidence directly from a device, one that's auditable, not prone to memory lapse over time, and one that you might say has total recall? So never mind human versus machine, it is less than 75 years since United States law stated that Chinese people could not be classed as witnesses. Are we going to spend another 75 deciding whether to allow a machine to fit into that same definition? Definitions are only useful until we learn something we didn't know at the time we made them. In the other direction, we have some established legal remedies that AI has turbocharged, like the ancient concept of trespass. If you're the occupier of private space, you're not only entitled to stop someone coming into your office or your shop or your home, you're empowered to remove them physically. And if AI-driven cameras can help you stop the person who came in and abused your staff last week from doing so again this week, then that is arguably just a modern means of enforcing an accepted ancient right, isn't it? And it's not just lawyers who need to reflect on these things. Even some of our cherished sociological research will have to rewind and start again. I'll give you an example. Here's an undergraduate staple. Do CCTV cameras prevent crime? Well, 50 years of studying this has produced volumes of material. But of course, that was when cameras just filmed things. That was before the camera knew who it was looking for. Now the AI-driven camera knows what Fraser looks like. And what is more, Fraser knows it too. Now the camera can teach other cameras how to find him. And each time they look for him, they get better at it. So to me, it seems a reasonable hypothesis that the presence of intelligent AI-enabled cameras in the high street or school or car park will have at least some direct impact on crime and criminality, and that the old CCTV studies from the digital Pleistocene era will be of very little relevance. So AI challenges our epistemological certainty that we've grown up with. So why then spend time stretching preformed constructs that were designed for another era to get them around AI? To me, developments in AI are not the same as discovering a new chemical element like aionium, and we fit it neatly into our periodic table. AI capability is existentially new, and doesn't something existentially new call for an existentially new form of regulation and governance? So how then do you regulate all this potential, the good, the bad, and yes, the ugly? Well, when faced with existential challenges, we humans usually reach for the consolation of familiarity and certainty. We have an unshakable, if somewhat naive, belief that what has got us this far will work. But confident familiarity aren't the goal for regulation, as I understand it. and we haven't been here before. So I think there's a lot of talk about the risks of AI. I think a regulatory risk is that we believe the answers are to be found in what we've already built for and in a pre-AI world. And I'm reminded here of Nasruddin's drunk, happily searching for his keys in the pool of light under the street lamp, not because that's where he dropped them, because that's the easiest place to look. Facial recognition technology is a good example in policing of how there is a temptation either to fetishize new technology or demonize it. So how far should the police be allowed to shrink all of our private worlds in pursuit of, say, someone who missed a court appearance because they slept in? What about someone with no convictions who the police believe may disrupt a sporting event to promote a political message? In my view, the police have got not just a moral obligation, but arguably a legal duty to use readily available resources to prevent certain types of harm to the citizen. And those resources include AI-driven technology, but it has to be intelligent and informed. I'm not a fan of actuarial policing, even after watching Minority Report. But back in real life, we saw what happened when we tried to predict whether a 17-year-old will pass their A-levels. What makes us think that we could predict whether that same teenager will be convicted of a crime in the same period? I still can't believe that police forces in the US and the UK thought they could do this at all. But to try and do it using an algorithm that was designed to predict aftershocks from earthquakes, I really don't understand. If only there was a film called Prophetic Irony. Other regulatory changes can be found downstream. The sentencing of offenders, for example, is a very complex process involving many variables and careful calculation. That's precisely what computers are good at. So is there anything inherently wrong with using algorithms to help judges do it? But then are we comfortable in getting large language models to write a moving victim impact statement for the inarticulate? Who is going to design, build, and oversee a regulatory policy and framework for these new challenges? Well, no one that's visible to me right now. We have to look at regulation for where AI is also being used against the police and the criminal justice system. If I'm on trial for an offence in Sheffield, I can get a very convincing deepfake video showing me in a street with friends several hundred miles away at the same time, cheaply and easily. And if my good quality but fake recording conflicts with genuine but old grainy CCTV footage that the police have to rely on, and they can't prove mine's are fake, the benefit of the doubt belongs to me and I can go home. And that's another reason against denying the police access to AI technology. The other side use it already. So maybe the police were onto something when they were thinking of earthquakes. AI regulation is a policy response to seismic changes in their landscape. With generative AI, we're no longer looking at regulating human activity. We're looking at the ability to create creators. So in some ways, this is digital embryology. So when you're considering the regulation of AI, there are three things I'd ask you to remember. One is when people talk about the possibility of bias in AI, remember AI's learning strategy in recommendation systems is confirmation bias. That's basically how they work. Two, don't mistake regulation for ethics. China has some of the clearest AI regulation in the world, according to Chatham House. And three, when you're looking for the human in the loop, AI accountability also needs society in the loop. And that's a political issue, not a technical or a legal one. So my final point about AI regulation and governance is this. You will hear a lot about people being replaced by machines and jobs being taken over in the future by AI. But there are some very big questions about experience and know-how here today. How does even an experienced investigator begin to investigate sophisticated AI-enabled crime and criminality, where there may be no crime scene, no human actor with a single verifiable identity, no legal definition, and no jurisdiction? Which brings us back to Hollywood. You may have seen the film Titanic, but it doesn't matter if you missed it, just picture the scene. A Silicon Valley genius team are doing a computer reconstruction of the final hours of the disaster, and they are modeling what happens when the human, the captain, begins to take action to save his stricken vessel. The computer modeler points out that this is the first time anyone sailed a ship like this because there's never been a ship made this way. And he says portentously, at this moment, Captain Smith has 40 years of experience against him. Everything he knows is wrong. How are we going to deal with a situation where everything we've learned so far may now be wrong, and we have 100 years of experience against us? How are we going to train and equip existing police officers and staff for an AI-driven world where no one's been before? Or for that matter, pilots, politicians, or even actors. How are we to regulate a world where we can have and be everything, everywhere, all at once? Maybe we just ask ChatGPT to draft a framework and we take the rest of the year off. Or perhaps the answer will be in the manifestos published in advance of the general election. Can't hardly wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fraser, thank you very much. I maybe should introduce you to a couple of manifesto writers, because I think the conversation needs to start about now for what might be in policy deliberations in a year. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. And I should add at this point, there is no dumb question in this subject, or if there is, I will be asking them, because I think we really run the risk of sort of absenting ourselves from discussions about things where we feel that we perhaps don't have enough of an appraisal of what this new technology is and does. And as Kaska pointed out at the beginning, we are talking about quite a range of different types of intervention and different types of applications. So, you know, it's what you want to ask about is important. Please put it in. Can I ask both of you the obvious question that arises from your introductions, which is that really isn't this about the responsibility for the judgments being made? Isn't this really about the issues that we have here are the question of, are we delegating responsibility to the technology when we're talking about education or we're talking about the courtroom? Or are we using it as a tool? And there seems to be some confusion, conflict, and some quite different issues raised by this. And I think perhaps worth highlighting also that I think we're all aware that we live in a world where politicians really love delegating difficult decisions. My whole world is of dealing with the kind of conflicts around science and evidence in society. And there's nothing that politicians like more when they're faced with discussions like incinerators and the storage of legacy nuclear waste and things like this, to say the geologists will decide, or we're going to set up a panel of of geneticists on this one, and hope that nothing comes to their door. So I think we all feel a bit anxious, right the way down to the local authority that would really rather not have to explain why some people haven't got housing. It's the computer says no and all that. We've seen it all with Horizon. And so I want both of you really to talk a bit about this subject. Is it really what we're talking about here is we're fearful of people making themselves unaccountable, of us losing that accountable decision-making chain? Kaska, I don't want to take you first on this if you've got thoughts.
I have a lot of thoughts on the subject. Well, I think we are delegating collectively and individually to the technology. I will start with this. And, having worked and continuing to work at the intersection of technology and human cognition and learning, this is one thing that really does keep coming back for me as a priority issue. It's not just because these tools are available and as you said, they intervene with our thinking and decision making. It's also about how we are actually being constructed at a biological level. Our brains have a tendency to actually automate anything that they can. And so we do need to be mindful. I mean, this also spotlights the necessity to actually look more broadly, not just at the technology itself and the products that are being designed and deployed, but at the kind of the basis on which they are being developed, at the evidence that they deliver in terms of the interference, interaction, support that they provide in context, in interactions with the users, with different kinds of users. I mean, we have a tendency to speak about AI as if it's one big monolithic thing. We tend to speak about the AI applications and the different contexts as monolithic things. And you know, the example of education is a really good one, because we also have a tendency to talk about education as one monolithic thing, and we know that it's not. People learn in different ways, people learn in different domains, people learn at different ages, and so on and so forth. So I think for me, there is a very pressing need to examine and to ask questions, interrogate those questions in a kind of transdisciplinary way, and not only transdisciplinary way, in a situated and contextualized way. The bottom line is that we don't have clear answers. We don't have you know, policy ready kind of directives that we can you know, deliver on a plate at the moment. There are more questions than answers, but what we do what we are beginning to understand is how complex the relationship between these technologies and our minds actually is. So maybe I will stop at this. I don't know whether it's not over vague, but
no, and I think this is the thing, isn't it? What we're talking about is the urgent need to put something on the map, but in a way that requires further research, and thinking about how to do that in a straightforward policy way, you know, is going to be very difficult, because obviously there's the belief that researchers are always asking for more money for research. So explaining why specifically and what specifically needs to be researched, I think that's the key thing, and what's at stake. I think that's going to be important. Fraser, on this subject of giving up our autonomy, giving up our responsibility.
Yes, it has to be multi-layered, it has to be multidisciplinary, it has to be focused on, I think it's the outcomes that we're concerned about, or the wrongs that we're trying to avoid or regulate, or the benefits that we're trying to create, because they are substantially different, even within the same sector. I'll give you an example. A chief constable I spoke to in 2021 was using AI already in a very large police force to issue new uniform to his staff. Why wouldn't you delegate that responsibility? It's a tedious decision you don't want anybody else doing. It's predictable, it's non-operational, it's not sensitive, it's very cheap to do it, and keep the same resources and put them to other use. But that is a police use of AI. And so again, if we lump it all together monolithically, as Kaska said, we get confused with some of this stuff, and we can lose things. At the other end of the scale, anyone who has watched 10 seconds of online child sexual abuse, pay to view child rape website material, will see that if you can get a computer to watch 10,000 hours of that, and to try and recognize both perpetrators and victims in real time, and that improves your way of detecting both, why wouldn't you do it? Even if you don't want the police using facial recognition in Oxford Street, it's a wholly different use case with an entirely different kind of a democratic legitimacy to it. But I can't think, if you filled a room full of right-thinking people and said, but do you think the police ought to be allowed, within very tight constraints, to use it in such offending as this? And we're researching this with Europol right across member states now at my university. Shouldn't they be allowed to do it? So we also have to be cautious in banning things and saying, well, the police should never be allowed to use this type of technology, because there may well be occasions where you say, okay, well, other than that, and other than that. When you come back to policy, this is why I think it's so challenging. If you're issuing new software, you can keep patching it every month, every year. People expect it. If you keep patching policy, you probably get 2 goes, and then it looks like you don't know what you're doing.
As we saw with COVID, indeed.
Yeah, so that's that's not a good place to be. So one of the things that we have spent 3 years researching and producing with Europol, with CEPOL, with Eurojust, are some international accountability principles for the use of AI by policing and law enforcement. And it starts with pre-procurement, and it goes right the way through to a review of whether your algorithm is performing in the way that you thought it was when you first put it out there. And I think a principles-based approach is probably the one that we've probably got the most confidence in at the starting point. But at the moment, I completely agree with Kaska. There is a lot of lumping everything together and saying, well, it's either bad or it's good or we don't know.
Well, then I can see this point, and I think it's actually highlighted in some of the questions where you've got Debbie Collins is asking about the use of AI in informing teacher planning, which Kaska, you might want to pick up later on in the discussion. But there you can see a bit similarly to some of the examples you just outlined, Fraser. A straightforward tool use. It's hard to argue with that, and you wouldn't want that in the same category necessarily as some of the more reorganizing elements of the software that we are now looking, for example, the basis of identity in the future, and what is going to be the basis of digital identity. That's a much more fundamental discussion for us to be having. I do feel, though, that when you said earlier in the discussion, in your presentation, you said that we need to be ready. We need to, have the conceptual tools to get our minds around this. There is a renegotiation, isn't there, of where human responsibility lies. So, we have got, if we take the court case, we've got an understanding of where expert witnesses play their role, the limitations of that. There's a lot of convention laid down around that. But as we saw in those of you who've watched the Horizon post office scandal unfold, the negotiation of where human beings needed to take responsibility for errors in the system. So it's not that it's not about whether or not the system was wrong. It was about if you look at those hearings, they've really been about that kind of surprise, that shock almost, that people got carried away with making the assumption that the system was right. And it's now kind of sticking that responsibility back on those people for that period of time. I feel like there's a lot of renegotiation that needs to be had here about which bits are the testable, or the bits decided by the tech, and which bits we insist on humans taking responsibility, and perhaps we need to look at what happens if we create a situation where people will absent themselves from responsibility. I mean, I'm looking at the teacher situation there too. At what point we need to have that conversation, don't we, Kaska, about if the AI is being used in a setting, how much responsibility does it change the responsibility for delivering? Let's keep the formal setting, a formal education.
Absolutely, but I think this discussion needs to also involve the discussion around how I go back to my point about the ecosystem, because I think this is absolutely essential. At the moment, we have a situation where we have certain stakeholders developing these technologies with particular assumptions in mind, and they are not necessarily verified, and tested and validated. And others are essentially treated as consumers. And apart from all the issues around the fact that public services are increasingly being turned into kind of a market, that also prevents a real innovation with technology and societal innovation, because we are agreeing to a standard model of a sort of these technologies of AI, without really questioning whether this is the only model that we may have. So we are in a situation where part of the society is being disempowered in terms of, influencing what kind of tools are being developed to support them in their different activities and professional kind of capacities, or and otherwise, in fact. This means that the technologies that are being currently available are very inflexible, and at the same time we kind of fed this rhetoric that these technologies are far better than the humans are in some respects. I'm thinking here about for example, machine learning based technologies which operate on voluminous data, and indeed, these are extremely efficacious technologies for categorizing and classifying data, and they are far better than humans. So I think, I think we really need to kind of appreciate the need for looking at the context, asking what is needed in different contexts, but asking, the actual practitioners in those contexts, and I don't mean just educational practitioners, and also really thinking based on this, thinking about how we can design technologies that are not only flexible, but actually that also respond to our kind of neurocognitive predispositions of naturally delegating, anything that we can delegate to, to either others or to tools that can do these things for us, because it really is an interplay between the technology and the way that we are built.
Well, let's come back to this. I've got an idea starting to take shape that Catherine Bentley's question about priorities has prompted. I'm going to put this to you both in a moment. But Fraser, did you want to say something about this whole sort of negotiation of which bits we leave to human judgment?
Yeah, I think if you remove the GDPR bit, which is where most of the lawyers run to about automated decision making as a legal requirement to have people involved, but this is policy area, isn't it? So that there are, I think, 3 vantage points that I've used since coming into this particular area of activity and regulation when I'm looking at both the questions and potential solutions and the risks. One is the technologically possible, what can be done. One is the legally permissible, what must or mustn't be done. And one is the societally acceptable, what people will either tolerate or expect to be done. And this is really important when it comes to public services. And the first 2 get most of the airtime. Mm-hmm. But the third one can only be, if you live in a democracy, a policy issue for those in government. And I think that the reality is there needs to be a much closer nexus between the policy making and reviewing, because it's changing all the time, and the people who put you in office. Now, this isn't an advert for the resurgence of democracy, but actually, if you can't get democracy to work in this setting, you're kind of better off not having it, because someone's got to make the decision. Is this a machine or is this a human deliberation? And we do it with some national security stuff, and we do it with some, very high level sort of counterterrorism decisions can only be made by ministers. I think that is going to move down to sort of local authority level, or perhaps even sort of boroughs in some areas, where you're saying, right, you were elected on the mandate to take this kind of decision. So actually, I think this may bring us closer to having that as a reality. But
well, it certainly shines a big light on commissioning and evaluation, doesn't it? And the capability that's in there. And these are obviously evaluation, the lack of evaluation for policy is an age-old issue that we're seeing some steps to address. And maybe AI and the adoption of new technologies in this space are maybe that's going to provoke an evaluation revolution, or perhaps it should be. Here's my thought from the questions that have been coming in. Kaska talked earlier about the need to have all parties in this debate, And there is a real concern about, commercial operators sort of just lobbing stuff over the wall, whether that's over the school gate, over the hospital wall, whatever, not understanding the context into which they're putting it. We've seen, Fraser, we've seen police forces adopt all sorts of stuff. I mean, I cut my teeth on police forces adopting daft lie detector stuff that was actually baloney. When I got into this sort of whole, can we rely on it? Where's the evidence? Action, and so we know that there's a real risk of adoption of misleading or badly suited technologies. Is there a really good policy proposal that could come out of this that would perhaps call for 4 or 5 clear commissions where we pulled together exactly the right kind of discussion and funded that, Kaska, and asked for any new incoming government to be funding a really searching discussion about where responsibility sits and what services are appropriate to introduce into these different domains of justice and education?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure whether I have a clear answer. I think I will reiterate my point that we do need to we do need to look at nurturing and creating ecosystems which are context specific. It's really critical. It's really critical to bring people to the table, not only as commentators and advisor, but as co-creators. So an environment needs to be created, and it is really asked for, actually, increasingly, by, certainly within education, by teachers, an environment in which they can be empowered to make informed decisions about these technologies in the context of their practices, and where they can actually experiment with these technologies and influence the way that they are being designed. And maybe we should also look back at the work, on collective action by Elinor Ostrom, to see whether we can draw some of the lessons from her framework, from her thinking about how we address very unusual, I think, questions around AI and the policy that addresses it, that actually allows us to move at pace, to actually respond in time, because this is something that is an issue here. The technology moves faster than the policy can, and which actually this within this collective action framework, whether we can negotiate, understand first of all, and then negotiate between the different and often conflicting interests that are present at the discussion, negotiation, and co-creation table. Again, I hope this is not over vague, but to me, this is it stands out as one of the critical kind of points for action to rethink the way that we inform policy and take action as a consequence.
Well, then this brings us to the question of and this is, I think, actually looking at the discussion going on online here, this is the question that Debbie Collins has followed up on, which is that there's also, by having that discussion, it's incumbent upon all of us to be equipped for it, isn't it? So it's not enough, and I think Fraser was kind of looking to challenge this idea that we just sort of dig our heels into the ground and say, oh, it's too much, too fast, and run to sort of really fairly safe territory of talking about privacy and ethics, instead of actually getting our teeth into some of the knotty problems that you outlined. I understood that, Fraser, that there's this point about we actually owe it to ourselves to become much better at having these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the question for me will be, if we don't do it that way, well, how are we going to do it? We're kind of saying, well, it's completely hands off, and things will just proliferate, and some of those we'll regret. Now, we can't spot all of them, but it's a great get out for whether it's a private company or a police force to say, but you didn't even give us any guidance, or let alone guide rails. Therefore, we tried it and it went wrong. So it's still coming back to central policy. I think there's an important distinction at the moment that we'll have to keep in mind between public services and necessary services and private consumerism of tech. I mean, almost all the tech is driven by convenience, and in a kind of retail setting. And it is about wizardry. It is about, well, you've had this for an hour now, you should be bored of it. Here's a new one. And people, if they like that, if people want to use their phone to access the Ring doorbell from the other side of the world and see who's coming and going, or read the license plate of a car on their drive, or fly a drone with it, all of which you can do now, with your smartphone, that's entirely a matter for them, really. But it needs some form of regulation somewhere, but that applies to the private citizen. It goes back to my point of trespass.
The lack of social guardrails is actually a brake on innovation, and this might be a very good point to be leading with on any communication into policy. But in a sense, not knowing whether you're going to, be up in front of a select committee questioned for your adoption of this technology in the future, or that you're right, whether or not you are running against public accountability. That's actually a brake on innovation. Exactly,
because you need where the technology providers and the public sector users, like the police, are both struggling, is that they need to have confidence to invest in the technology. But that confidence can't just come from the fact that, a lawyer like me says to them, well, your chances of being sued, are X, or, you can always say that it wasn't regulated, therefore, I mean, that doesn't work. So they are all saying, please give us some guides. One of the things that really interested me and slightly frustrated me as a commissioner was when we had the coronation going on, and there was lots of concern around what constituted, I don't know, walking slowly in a road for Just Stop Oil or something. What was the level of specificity that we needed in our already well-embedded laws for public order and highway obstruction? The police needed even further refinement to get it absolutely right. And the government gave it to them in terms of secondary legislation. But they deployed live facial recognition cameras across tens of thousands of people with absolutely no guidance whatsoever. How does that make sense? So if you're going to have the confidence as a local police and crime commissioner to invest in cameras, or to invest in ANPR number plate readers, or anti sort of cyber hacking investigative tools, because you're the one that signs the contract, if you're the police and crime commissioner, you've got to have confidence that you're not going to be on the telly every night explaining why you wasted money. But you're also going to get on the telly if you didn't use it, and then somebody says, well, you could have stopped this if you'd bought this kit,
exactly,
$3.99 from Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to wrap up here, and that is a good point. It's Sinead Murphy's question that we've kind of ended up finishing on, which is, what are the priorities? I think we can see clearly that education and crime and justice are clear priorities for areas of action. I think we can always throw healthcare in there, because healthcare is always in there. And perhaps we need to look at one or two others as well. I'd love to see something like this go forward. I hope that others of you who joined this can see that there's certainly a pressing case, and that the social sciences has a huge amount to offer here. So thank you to the Campaign for Social Science for putting this on. I think it's opened up far more questions it could ever answer. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you will take this forward as a discussion too.